The strangest people often arrive wearing the least impressive shoes. Rain had fallen over downtown Chicago since before sunrise, covering the streets with a silver reflection that turned every passing headlight into a ribbon of light across the pavement. Inside the magnificent glass lobby of Hawthorne Tower, the morning unfolded with its usual precision. Executives hurried toward elevators while assistants balanced coffee cups and laptop bags. Security officers greeted familiar faces without interrupting the steady rhythm of arrivals. Maintenance crews quietly dried the marble floor before another wave of polished shoes erased every trace of their work. It was a place where appearances carried almost as much weight as achievement. Lucas Park stepped through the revolving doors exactly at 8 o'clock. His charcoal overcoat rested perfectly across his shoulders, his tailored suit looked untouched by the weather, and his calm expression revealed nothing to the dozens of employees who instinctively stepped aside to give him space. He acknowledged no whispers, encouraged no conversations, and walked with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to every door opening before he reached it. Most people knew him only as the brilliant businessman who occupied the executive offices on the highest floors. Others quietly repeated rumors that followed his remarkable influence throughout Chicago. No matter what anyone believed, one fact remained unchanged. Lucas Park rarely noticed the people around him. At the opposite end of the lobby, Ava Richardson hurried toward the employee entrance, carrying a small canvas bag, a folded housekeeping uniform, and a paper cup of coffee that threatened to spill with every hurried step. She had left home before dawn after helping her elderly neighbor restart a stubborn furnace, leaving almost no time to change into her work shoes. Instead, she wore the soft bunny slippers she normally reserved for walking around her apartment, planning to change as soon as she reached the housekeeping locker room. She laughed quietly at herself while weaving through the growing crowd, hoping nobody important would notice. Fate, however, rarely respected careful plans. As Lucas crossed the freshly polished lobby, one of his associates turned unexpectedly to answer a phone call. The corner of a rolling briefcase lightly bumped a housekeeping cart parked beside the elevator bank. Buckets shifted. Fresh towels slid sideways. Cleaning supplies rattled against the metal frame as the cart tilted dangerously before stopping against a decorative planter. Several nearby employees froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone simply watched to see what would happen next. Ava immediately hurried across the lobby, her bunny slippers making almost no sound against the marble floor. She steadied the cart with both hands before turning toward Lucas. Their eyes met for the first time. The enormous lobby seemed strangely quiet. Without raising her voice or showing the slightest fear, Ava spoke with calm honesty. "Excuse me, sir. I know it was an accident, but could you please help me put everything back where it belongs?" The request surprised everyone within earshot. One executive quietly looked away. A receptionist stopped typing. Even David Miller, the senior security officer, held his breath. No one remembered the last time anyone had spoken to Lucas Park with such unaffected confidence. Lucas looked at the scattered towels, then at the young woman standing before him in a housekeeping uniform half hidden beneath a raincoat and wearing unmistakable bunny slippers. For reasons he could not explain, he felt no irritation, only curiosity. Without a single word, he removed his overcoat, handed it to Michael Kong, and crouched beside the cart. Together they gathered folded towels, straightened bottles, and carefully reorganized every shelf exactly as Ava instructed. She thanked him with the same warm sincerity she would have offered anyone else. "Perfect," she said with an easy smile. "Now nobody has to clean the lobby twice." Lucas stood quietly, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve before looking at her once more. She smiled, wished him a pleasant morning, and disappeared toward the employee hallway without asking his name, his position, or offering another glance behind her. Michael stared after her in complete disbelief before turning back toward Lucas. "Should I speak with building management?" he asked cautiously. Lucas kept watching the hallway where the young woman had vanished, then slowly shook his head. "No," he answered. After a thoughtful pause, his voice became almost reflective. "Find out why I cannot stop thinking about someone wearing bunny slippers." The following morning, Hawthorne Tower looked exactly as polished as it had the day before, yet something invisible had shifted beneath its carefully ordered routine. Employees still crossed the marble lobby carrying briefcases and coffee. Elevators continued rising with quiet precision, and security officers greeted familiar faces with practiced smiles. Only Lucas Park noticed that his attention no longer followed the schedule waiting inside his office. Instead, his eyes briefly searched the employee entrance before he walked toward the executive elevators. Michael Kong noticed the subtle hesitation immediately, but chose not to mention it. After years of working beside Lucas, he had learned that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. Meanwhile, Ava Richardson had already changed into her housekeeping uniform and neatly stored the bunny slippers inside her locker. She laughed softly with another housekeeper who teased her about arriving at work wearing bedroom shoes. It was either bunny slippers or soaking wet sneakers, Ava replied with an easy smile. The slippers one. The two women continued preparing fresh linens while discussing ordinary things like grocery prices, weekend plans, and the unpredictable Chicago weather. Nothing about Ava suggested she had spent even a single minute thinking about the important businessman she had asked to help her the previous morning. To her, he had simply been another person standing near a cart that needed attention. Later that morning, Lucas unexpectedly left a meeting 5 minutes early and walked through one of the lower executive floors instead of returning directly to his office. He told himself he wanted to inspect recent renovations, although the project had already been completed weeks earlier. As he approached the central hallway, he noticed Ava kneeling beside an elderly maintenance employee who struggled to tighten the wheel on a supply cart. Without hesitation, she steadied the cart while the older man finished the repair, thanked him sincerely, and helped organize the shelves before continuing on her way.
No supervisors watched. No recognition waited.
She simply noticed someone needed help and acted before anyone else could. Lucas remained standing several yards away, quietly observing a kind of generosity that required no audience. Good morning, Ava said cheerfully after finally noticing him. Everything stayed on the cart today. Lucas glanced toward the neatly organized shelves and allowed the faintest smile to appear. That seems to be because someone prepared it very well. Ava shrugged with natural humility. It makes everyone else's job easier. Before Lucas could answer, a young intern hurried around the corner carrying a stack of presentation boards that immediately slipped from his hands, scattering papers across the polished hallway. Ava stepped forward without thinking, gathering the boards while reassuring the embarrassed intern that nothing had been damaged. Lucas instinctively bent down beside her and picked up the remaining documents. The intern looked from one to the other with obvious surprise before thanking them repeatedly. As the young man hurried away toward a conference room, Ava accepted the gratitude with the same warm smile she offered everyone else. You seem to spend a great deal of time helping strangers, Lucas observed while handing her the final presentation board. Ava looked at him with gentle curiosity. Most strangers only stay strangers until someone is kind to them. The answer settled quietly between them. Lucas found himself unable to dismiss such simple words because they carried a truth no boardroom had ever taught him. Ava checked the time on the small watch attached to her uniform. I should get back before my supervisor wonders where I disappeared. She thanked him once again, wished him a pleasant day, and continued down the hallway pushing her housekeeping cart with calm confidence. Lucas remained standing where she had left him, watching the cart disappear around the corner. Michael approached several moments later carrying an updated schedule. Your next meeting begins in 10 minutes, he reminded him. Lucas nodded without looking away from the empty hallway. Move tomorrow's first meeting 15 minutes later, he said quietly. Michael raised an eyebrow but made the adjustment without asking why. Deep inside, Lucas already knew the answer. He simply was not ready to admit that he had begun rearranging his entire morning for the chance to spend a few ordinary minutes with a woman who had confronted him without fear while wearing bunny slippers. Over the next several days, the carefully measured rhythm of Hawthorne Tower continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened, yet Lucas Park quietly discovered that the smallest moments now carried the greatest weight. Meetings still began precisely on schedule. Financial reports continued arriving in neat folders across his polished desk. Executives discussed acquisitions, investments, and expansion plans with the same disciplined confidence that had built his remarkable reputation. Even so, Lucas found his attention drifting toward the ordinary sounds that floated up from the lower floors, the distant wheels of housekeeping carts, the quiet greetings exchanged between employees, and the laughter that occasionally echoed through the hallways before disappearing just as quickly. He had spent years believing efficiency was the highest form of excellence. Ava Richardson seemed to move through every day, proving that kindness accomplished something efficiency never could. One cool Thursday morning, Lucas entered the lobby 5 minutes later than usual after an unexpected conference call delayed his arrival. For reasons he could not explain, disappointment settled over him when he noticed the employee entrance already standing empty. He continued toward the executive elevators, convinced he had simply missed another ordinary morning, until he heard a familiar voice drifting from the reception desk. Ava stood beside David Miller, the senior security officer, helping him tape a handwritten birthday card onto the employee bulletin board. Several staff members had secretly signed it during the previous week after learning David planned to retire before Christmas. Ava stepped back, tilted her head, then laughed softly. It needs to be just a little higher or he will pretend he never noticed it. David smiled with obvious appreciation before returning to his post. Lucas remained several steps away, watching another quiet act of generosity unfold without expectation of praise. As Ava turned toward the elevators, she noticed him waiting. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "You almost missed the surprise." Lucas glanced toward the birthday card. "Was that your idea?" Ava shook her head. "Everyone helped. I only remembered that people should celebrate the ones who make them feel safe every day." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside together. For several peaceful seconds, neither of them spoke. The gentle hum of the elevator filled the silence as the city slowly disappeared beneath them. Finally, Lucas looked toward her. "Do you always notice everyone?" Ava smiled thoughtfully. "Not always. Sometimes I miss things too. I just try to pay attention before people stop believing they matter." The answer lingered in the quiet space between them. When the elevator reached the 12th floor, the doors opened for a young receptionist carrying 2 overflowing storage boxes. Before she could ask for help, Ava stepped out, lifted one of the boxes, and walked beside her down the hallway. Lucas watched through the closing doors until both women disappeared around the corner, talking and laughing like old friends. He reached the executive floor several moments later, yet instead of walking directly into his office, he paused beside the wide windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Michael quietly approached, carrying the day's schedule. "You have noticed something," he observed carefully. Lucas nodded almost absent-mindedly. "She treats every person as though they have been important all along." Michael looked out across the skyline before asking the question that had quietly waited for days. "And how does that make you feel?" Lucas remained silent for a thoughtful moment before answering with unusual honesty.
It
"Makes me wonder how many people have walked past me believing they were invisible." Michael closed the schedule without another word. As sunlight spread across the glass towers surrounding Hawthorne Tower, Lucas realized that he was no longer looking forward to the next important negotiation or business victory. Instead, he found himself waiting for another ordinary conversation with the woman who had unknowingly begun teaching him that the strongest people were often the ones who carried the lightest hearts. The following Monday began beneath a clear autumn sky, and sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of Hawthorne Tower, filling the lobby with warm reflections that softened even the busiest morning. Employees hurried toward elevators carrying laptops, coffee cups, and presentation folders, while the familiar rhythm of another workweek quietly unfolded. Lucas Park stepped through the revolving doors precisely on time, yet instead of walking directly toward the executive elevators, he instinctively glanced toward the employee entrance. He did not expect to find Ava there. Somehow, he hoped to. A few moments later she appeared, balancing a tray of fresh coffee for the housekeeping team while greeting nearly everyone she passed by name. She smiled at the receptionists, thanked the security officers for working through the weekend, and stopped long enough to ask one of the maintenance technicians whether his injured shoulder was feeling any better. None of the conversations lasted more than a few seconds, yet every person she left behind seemed lighter than before. Lucas quietly realized that she possessed a rare ability to improve a room simply by walking through it. Later that morning, while reviewing financial reports in his office, Grace Lewis, the building manager, entered carrying several newspapers that had been delivered for the executive conference room. As she placed them neatly on the table, one folded open to the business section, revealing a large photograph of Lucas attending an international leadership summit. The headline praised his business achievements, but also repeated the reputation that had followed him for years, describing him as the influential Korean Mafia boss whose disciplined organization had become one of the city's most powerful corporate empires. Grace apologized for leaving the newspaper open, but Lucas simply folded it closed without expression. He had grown accustomed to headlines telling only fragments of a story. An hour later, Ava entered the employee lounge during her scheduled break and noticed the same newspaper resting on a nearby table. She glanced at the photograph, immediately recognizing the man she had met beside the housekeeping cart. Curiosity replaced surprise as she quietly read the article. The words described influence, extraordinary wealth, relentless discipline, and a mysterious past surrounded by speculation. When she finished reading, she carefully folded the newspaper exactly as she had found it and returned to work without mentioning it to anyone. Throughout the afternoon, the article lingered quietly in her thoughts. The headlines described someone distant and intimidating, yet every conversation she had shared with Lucas told a completely different story. Before leaving for the day, Ava stopped at a small coffee stand inside the lobby to purchase a simple sandwich and a cup of soup for an elderly courier who often skipped lunch during long delivery routes. As she turned away from the counter, she nearly walked into Lucas, who had just finished another executive meeting. She smiled naturally, holding the paper bag in one hand. "Good afternoon," she said. Lucas noticed the folded newspaper tucked beneath her arm and immediately understood what she had probably read. For the first time in years, uncertainty crossed his otherwise composed expression. "You know who I am now," he said quietly. Ava looked at him for a thoughtful moment before answering. "I know what the newspaper says." Lucas waited without speaking. She gently continued, "But newspapers usually write about what people have done. They rarely have enough room to write about who someone is becoming." Her words settled into the quiet lobby with remarkable calm. She handed the paper bag to the waiting courier with an encouraging smile before turning back toward Lucas one last time. "Have a good evening," she said warmly, exactly as she always had, then walked toward the employee exit without changing her pace, her expression, or the kindness that had first caught his attention. Lucas remained standing in the middle of the lobby long after she disappeared through the glass doors, realizing that while the rest of the city continued judging him by old headlines, one ordinary woman had quietly chosen to judge him by the person standing in front of her instead. The conversation in the lobby stayed with Lucas long after the building emptied for the evening. He had spent years preparing answers for reporters, investors, and rivals, yet a few gentle words from Ava had reached places that carefully rehearsed speeches never could. She had not defended his past, and she had not ignored it. Instead, she had quietly acknowledged that people could continue becoming someone better. The thought remained with him as he stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Michael Kong entered carrying the final reports of the day, but immediately noticed that Lucas had not opened a single folder. "Something is different," Michael observed. Lucas looked toward the city lights. "I have spent years protecting my reputation," he replied calmly. "She seems more interested in protecting people." Michael said nothing because he already knew there was no argument against that truth. The following morning, Hawthorne Tower welcomed another busy workday. Ava moved from floor to floor replacing fresh towels, organizing supply closets, and greeting employees with the same effortless kindness that had become part of the building itself. While cleaning a conference room, she noticed two newly hired custodians quietly discussing whether they could afford an expensive professional certification required for future promotions. They stopped talking the moment they realized someone else had entered, but Ava simply smiled and encouraged them not to lose hope. Sometimes opportunities appear after people decide they are worth preparing for, she said before returning to her work. She never imagined that someone standing just outside the partially open doorway had heard every word. Lucas remained in the hallway for another moment before continuing toward his office. Later that afternoon, he called Michael inside. "I want a proposal," he said. "Every employee in this building should have access to company-funded training and certification programs if they want to grow professionally." Michael looked up from his notebook. "That includes housekeeping, maintenance, and security?" Lucas nodded without hesitation. "Especially them." Michael smiled slightly before writing the instruction. "Should we announce where the idea came from?" Lucas quietly shook his head.
No.
Good decisions do not become better because people know who made them. Several weeks later, the new education program was announced throughout Hawthorne Tower. Employees gathered in break rooms reading the notices with expressions that shifted from surprise to genuine excitement. Some talked about earning management certificates. Others discussed language classes, technical training, and continuing education they had believed would always remain out of reach. Ava read every page carefully before smiling to herself. "This is going to change a lot of lives," she whispered. That afternoon, she found Lucas waiting beside the central elevator as another meeting concluded. "Have you seen the announcement?" she asked with unmistakable enthusiasm. Lucas answered carefully. "I have." Ava looked toward the hallway, where employees continued celebrating the unexpected opportunity. Whoever decided to do this must really believe every job matters. Lucas studied her expression before asking quietly, "Do you think they do?" Ava smiled with complete certainty. "I think people reveal what they believe by the way they treat those who cannot repay them." The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside together, surrounded by peaceful silence. Lucas realized she had unknowingly answered a question he had been asking himself for weeks. He no longer wanted to become someone worthy of admiration. He wanted to become someone worthy of the quiet trust she offered so freely to everyone around her, and for the first time in many years, that goal mattered more than any victory. Waiting inside the boardroom. Autumn gradually settled over Chicago, and with every passing week Hawthorne Tower seemed to breathe a little differently. Employees smiled more often in the hallways. Security officers lingered in friendly conversations instead of exchanging only quick greetings. Housekeeping staff discussed evening classes they had already enrolled in through the new education program, while maintenance workers proudly compared certification schedules that once seemed impossible to afford. The changes spread quietly through the building, yet very few people knew exactly where they had begun. Ava Richardson watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, believing that someone in leadership had finally decided to notice the people who kept the building running every day. She never imagined that her own words had planted the first seed. One rainy afternoon, after finishing work on the executive floor, Ava stepped into a nearly empty employee lounge carrying a small container of homemade vegetable soup. She noticed Sandra Lewis, the building manager, sitting alone at a corner table studying several budget reports with obvious fatigue. Without making a ceremony of it, Ava walked over and placed the container beside her. "You skipped lunch again," she said gently. Sandra looked up with surprise. "How did you know?" Ava smiled. "You always become quieter when you forget to eat." Sandra laughed softly and accepted the meal with sincere gratitude. At that exact moment, Lucas happened to pass the open doorway on his way back from a meeting. He slowed almost instinctively when he recognized Ava's voice. Hidden from view, he quietly watched as she treated the building manager with exactly the same kindness she had shown security officers, interns, maintenance workers, and complete strangers. There was never a calculation behind her generosity. She simply noticed what people needed before they found the courage to ask. Later that afternoon, Michael entered Lucas's office carrying proposals for several upcoming investments. Lucas read only the first page before placing the folder aside. How many employees work in this building?" he asked unexpectedly. Michael answered without hesitation. "Just over 800. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "I want every department to receive upgraded break rooms before winter. Better lighting, comfortable furniture, healthier vending options, and quiet spaces where people can actually rest." Michael looked at him for a long moment before smiling. "You're changing the building one decision at a time." Lucas glanced toward the city skyline beyond the glass windows. Someone reminded me that every person here deserves to feel seen. Several days later, construction crews quietly completed the first renovated employee lounge. New tables replaced worn furniture. Comfortable chairs surrounded bookshelves filled with donated novels. Fresh plants brightened the room, and large windows allowed natural sunlight to reach corners that had always felt forgotten. Employees entered cautiously at first, uncertain whether they belonged inside such a welcoming space. Ava stood near the doorway with several coworkers, looking around in genuine amazement. "This feels like someone finally remembered that people matter even when nobody is watching," she whispered. That evening, as most employees prepared to leave for home, Lucas found Ava waiting for the elevator with her housekeeping cart neatly organized for the next morning. She noticed him and smiled with the same natural warmth that had never changed despite everything she had learned about him. "The new lounge is beautiful," she said. "Whoever made that decision has a generous heart." Lucas looked at the closing elevator doors before answering quietly. "Maybe they simply listened to the right person." Ava laughed softly, assuming he meant one of the building managers, and stepped inside the elevator beside him. Neither of them spoke during the ride upward. They did not need to. The peaceful silence between them no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt comfortable, as though two completely different lives had gradually discovered a shared direction without either of them realizing exactly when the journey had begun. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than anyone expected, dusting the streets of Chicago with a thin layer of white that softened the city's constant movement. Hawthorne Tower stood quietly beneath the pale morning sky, its glass walls reflecting gentle winter light while employees hurried inside carrying scarves, umbrellas, and steaming cups of coffee. The building had changed over the past several months in ways that could not be measured by financial reports alone. Conversations sounded warmer. Laughter echoed more often through the hallways. Departments that had rarely spoken to one another now shared break rooms and celebrated birthdays together. Lucas Park noticed every difference without taking credit for any of them. Standing beside the executive windows before his first meeting, he watched employees entering the lobby below. His attention settled almost instinctively on Ava Richardson as she arrived carrying 2 reusable shopping bags instead of her usual work supplies. Curious, he quietly asked Michael whether something special was happening. Michael checked the schedule before answering. "The neighborhood community center is collecting winter coats for families this afternoon." Several employees volunteered after work. Lucas nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more. Throughout the morning, the image remained in his thoughts. By late afternoon, after the final executive meeting ended, he quietly canceled a private dinner invitation and instructed Michael to reschedule the evening. "Where are we going instead?" Michael asked. Lucas picked up his overcoat with calm certainty. "To the community center." When Lucas arrived, the modest brick building was already filled with volunteers sorting donated coats, books, canned food, and children's toys. There were no reporters, photographers, or business partners waiting to greet him. Only families, teachers, retired neighbors, and volunteers working together without concern for titles or influence. Near the back of the room, Ava knelt beside a young boy helping him choose a winter coat that actually fit. She adjusted the sleeves, zipped the jacket carefully, and smiled when the child proudly looked at himself in a nearby mirror. Lucas stood quietly watching until Ava finally noticed him. Genuine surprise crossed her face before. She walked over carrying another stack of donated blankets. "I did not expect to see you here," she admitted warmly. Lucas accepted several blankets from her hands. "Neither did I," he answered honestly. They spent the next 2 hours arranging donations, carrying heavy boxes, organizing bookshelves, and helping families without speaking very much. They did not need long conversations because the quiet rhythm of working together felt unexpectedly natural. During a short break, they stepped outside beneath softly falling snow. Children laughed nearby while building snowmen in the small park across the street. Ava wrapped her scarf a little tighter against the cold before looking toward Lucas. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Why have you changed so much?" Lucas remained silent for several moments as snowflakes settled across the shoulders of his dark overcoat. Finally, he smiled with unusual honesty. I do not think I changed because I met you. Ava listened quietly. I think I finally noticed the person I wanted to become after watching the way you treated everyone else. Ava lowered her eyes for a thoughtful moment before looking back at him with the same gentle expression that had greeted him from the very beginning. Then promise me something, she said softly. Do not become that person for me. Lucas waited. Become that person for yourself. Everyone else will simply be fortunate enough to meet him. The words settled into the peaceful winter evening as families continued laughing inside the community center. Lucas realized that every important decision he had made over the past several months had started with a woman who never asked him for anything except kindness, and as they walked back inside together carrying another box of donated coats, he quietly understood that the life he had been building no longer revolved around power, but around becoming worthy of the quiet respect reflected in her eyes. Several weeks passed, and winter settled comfortably across Chicago, transforming familiar streets into quiet avenues lined with fresh snow and glowing holiday lights. Hawthorne Tower remained as busy as ever, yet something inside the building had permanently changed. Employees no longer hurried past one another without speaking. Housekeeping staff shared lunch with office assistants. Executives occasionally stopped to thank maintenance workers for repairs that once would have gone unnoticed. Kindness had slowly become part of the building's culture, spreading so naturally that few people remembered what life had felt like before. Ava Richardson continued moving through each day with the same gentle humility she had always possessed, never realizing how many lives had quietly shifted because someone powerful had chosen to follow the example she lived instead of the advice he usually received. One Friday afternoon, while organizing fresh linens on the executive floor, Ava noticed a small envelope resting neatly on top of her housekeeping cart. Curious, she opened it and found 2 tickets to a neighborhood holiday concert benefiting local children's literacy programs. There was no signature, only a handwritten note that read, "Some evenings are more meaningful when shared with someone who reminds the world to be kinder." Ava smiled to herself. She suspected exactly who had written the message, but appreciated the fact that he had allowed the invitation to remain simple. Later that evening, she found Lucas waiting outside the historic theater beneath softly falling snow. He wore a dark wool coat instead of his usual business attire, making him appear less like the influential businessman the newspapers admired and more like an ordinary man enjoying a peaceful winter evening. "I was beginning to wonder if you would come," he admitted with an almost embarrassed smile. Ava laughed gently. "You invited me to help children through music. That is a difficult invitation to refuse." Inside the theater, families filled every row while local school choirs performed traditional holiday songs beneath warm golden lights. During the intermission, volunteers collected donations for community reading programs, and without hesitation, both Ava and Lucas quietly joined them, greeting guests, organizing books, and helping elderly visitors find their seats. Nobody treated Lucas like an important figure. Nobody asked for photographs or business favors. For the first time in many years, he experienced the rare comfort of being appreciated simply for showing up. After the concert ended, they walked slowly through the snow-covered streets toward the parking garage. The city seemed unusually peaceful, with fresh snow muffling the usual sounds of traffic. As they reached a quiet intersection, they noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry several grocery bags while balancing an umbrella against the cold wind. Without exchanging a word, Ava reached for the groceries while Lucas held the umbrella and carefully walked beside the woman until she safely reached her apartment entrance. The grateful smile she offered them required no elaborate conversation. It was enough. Returning to the sidewalk, Ava tucked her hands into her coat pockets and looked toward the softly illuminated skyline. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "the newspapers were wrong about one thing." Lucas glanced at her with quiet curiosity. "Only one thing?" Ava smiled warmly. "They made you sound impossible to approach." Lucas laughed, the sound carrying gently through the quiet winter evening. "You confronted me the first day we met while wearing bunny slippers. I do not think you ever believed I was difficult to approach." Ava laughed with him, remembering the rainy morning that had started everything. "That was not courage," she admitted. I was just trying to save the towels. Lucas looked at her for a thoughtful moment before answering with complete sincerity. You are doing much more than that. They continued walking through the peaceful snowfall without rushing toward the end of the evening, both quietly understanding that the strongest relationships are rarely built through dramatic moments. They grow through ordinary days, shared purpose, gentle conversations, and the quiet decision to keep walking in the same direction, even after the world around them has completely changed. Nearly 1 year after the rainy morning that had quietly changed two lives, another ordinary workday began at Hawthorne Tower beneath a pale spring sunrise. The snow had disappeared, fresh green leaves framed the sidewalks once again, and employees crossed the familiar lobby with the same steady rhythm that marked every weekday. Yet the atmosphere inside the building felt entirely different from the one that had existed before Ava Richardson and Lucas Park first crossed paths. People greeted one another by name. Managers listened before giving instructions. Security officers laughed with receptionists. Housekeeping staff shared ideas with executives during lunch breaks without feeling invisible. Respect had quietly become part of the building itself. Lucas arrived a few minutes earlier than usual, carrying no urgency except the simple hope of beginning another day the way he now valued most. As he stepped through the revolving doors, he immediately noticed a familiar figure hurrying across the marble floor. Ava laughed to herself while balancing a canvas bag and a folded housekeeping uniform. Because an unexpected rain shower had soaked her work shoes during her morning commute, she had once again slipped on the same soft bunny slippers she had worn almost a year before. She looked down at them, shook her head with amused embarrassment, and hurried toward the employee hallway. Lucas smiled before she even noticed him. I was beginning to think those slippers had retired, he said. Ava looked up, surprised, before laughing with genuine warmth. Apparently they only come back for special occasions. They walked toward the elevators together, passing employees who greeted them naturally, no longer surprised to see the company's quiet leader walking beside the housekeeper everyone admired. As they reached the familiar elevator, the doors began to close. Without hesitation, Lucas reached forward and pressed the open button, holding the doors exactly as he had done on the morning when everything had begun. Ava stepped inside, looked around the quiet elevator, and smiled knowingly. Some traditions are worth keeping. Lucas nodded. This one changed my life. The elevator rose smoothly through the building while morning sunlight reflected across the polished steel walls. Neither of them felt any need to hurry the silence. After a few peaceful moments, Ava looked toward him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not asked you to help with that housekeeping cart? Lucas answered without hesitation. I would have gone upstairs believing I already understood what mattered. He paused before continuing with quiet honesty. Instead, I met someone who showed me that influence means very little if the people standing beside you never feel seen. Ava lowered her eyes with quiet humility. I only asked for help because the towels would have fallen. Lucas smiled gently. That is what I admire most. You never realized you were changing anything. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, but neither of them stepped out immediately. Employees waiting outside greeted them with easy smiles before continuing toward their own destinations. Michael watched from the hallway and quietly smiled to himself. He remembered the distant man who once measured success by completed negotiations and impressive headlines. Now the most important part of every morning lasted less than a minute inside an ordinary elevator. Lucas finally stepped out, then turned back toward Ava before the doors closed again. Thank you, he said simply. Ava tilted her head. For what? Lucas looked at the familiar bunny slippers one last time before meeting her eyes. For reminding me that extraordinary people rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they simply show up on a rainy morning wearing bunny slippers and ask a stranger to help pick up a few towels. The elevator doors closed gently, carrying Ava toward another ordinary workday, while Lucas remained standing in the quiet hallway wearing the peaceful smile that had once seemed impossible. Around him, Hawthorne Tower continued its familiar routine, yet every person who entered the building now walked through a place transformed not by power, wealth, or reputation, but by simple acts of kindness repeated often enough to change an entire community, proving that the strongest hearts are not remembered for the authority they possess, but for the dignity they help others discover. And that sometimes the greatest love story begins with nothing more remarkable than a rainy morning, a housekeeping cart, and a pair of well-worn bunny slippers.